From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bob Patrick, and I'm the director of the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. I'm delighted to see all of you here this afternoon. I'll be serving as your host for this session titled The Human Side of War. Over the next 4 hours, you will be entertained and listen to a stellar lineup of authors who have written about our nation's wars from the 20th and 21st century. They will trace some of the history many of us know about these conflicts, but more especially, they will talk about the impact of the stories of the individuals, men and women, who have fought these wars. They will explain to us how these personal accounts influence their writing and the importance of these veteran stories for our own understanding of the human experience of war. The human experience of war is something that the Veterans History Project has been collecting, preserving, and making accessible for the last 15 years. With nearly 100,000 collections that include veterans' oral histories and original documents from World War I to the conflicts of the past decade, this rich archive has been accumulated through a nationwide effort by citizens just like you, who have preserved the story of the veteran in their life. During the course of today's session, you will hear a lot of history, but I also hope it will show you how you can preserve the story of the veteran that you know and make it a part of the Library of Congress through the Veterans History Project. During the session breaks, we will be showing some of the clips of from the extensive archive of the Veterans History Project. Veterans History Project staff in their purple shirts are here in the hall today and have information to pass out to you to tell you how you can get involved and make you a part of what we call Do Your Part here in Washington, D.C. of collecting veteran stories. I know you're eager to hear from our first author, so I won't go on anymore. It is my honor to introduce the gentleman who will be interviewing Tom Brokaw today, who you've already heard from. David Rubenstein is the founder and CEO of the Carlyle Group, and we all owe him a great debt of gratitude as the lead benefactor for the National Book Festival. Let's give him a hand.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
He is a lover of history and the son of a United States Marine Corps World War II veteran who fought in the Pacific. We are privileged and honored to have him with us today to lead off this session focused on the greatest generation. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. David Rubenstein.
Thank you very much. So, our special guest, Tom Brokaw, doesn't need an elaborate introduction, but I'd like to give a very brief one if I could, in case there's somebody from outside the United States who doesn't know Tom Brokaw very well. Tom is a native of South Dakota, graduate of the University of South Dakota, got into broadcast journalism in Des Moines and then Atlanta, then ultimately joined NBC in California, then brought east to be the chief White House correspondent for NBC, and later became the host or the co-host of Today Show, and later for 22 years was the anchor and managing director of NBC Nightly News. He retired from that position in 2004, and when anchors often retire from these kind of positions, they kind of fade off into the sunset. But Tom began a whole new career as an author. And among the many books he's written is The Greatest Generation, about which we're going to talk in a moment, and several versions of that, subsequent editions of it. This book was published in 1998, and so therefore it's 17 years old, but still has a reservoir of inspiration for American people, and it's still in print, and people are reading it. The paperback edition is selling a great deal as well. This is the 15th year of publication for the paperback edition. Tom has also done a lot of broadcast journalism and other kinds of things since he's retired from NBC News. He's also been involved in a lot of philanthropic projects, member of the board of the Mayo Clinic, the International Rescue Committee, the Council on Foreign Relations, recipient of the Medal of Freedom, recipient of about 30 honorary degrees from leading colleges, and in addition to that, an extraordinary family man, father of 3 daughters, and married to lovely Meredith. For how many years?
53.
53 years, okay.
That always gets a round of applause, and my temptation is to say, and it's been hell every day of those 53 years.
Well,
it's been the contrary.
I would just say it wasn't love at first sight with Meredith, was it?
No, it
What
wasn't.
actually happened?
What happened is that I moved to this town called Yankton, South Dakota, which was, by South Dakota standards, kind of one of the bigger cities, 10,000 population. I'd lived in a succession of small towns and an army base. And when I got there, there was this stunning young woman that everyone knew about called Meredith Auld, who was a straight-A student, cheerleader. Her father was a prominent physician in town. We quickly became very close friends. She was a cheerleader, I was a jock. We were president, vice president of the student council, had the leads in the play. But as I've often characterized our relationship now, we never really went out because she thought I fooled around too much and I thought she didn't fool around enough, is really what it came down to. But we were very close friends. And then I went off to college with these big expectations of being a whiz kid. I'd been governor of Boise State and had scholarships in a lot of places. And I went off the rails really hard. My life was about chasing girls and drinking beer and having a good time. I went from the University of Iowa back to South Dakota, continued my errant ways, and actually dropped out of school. But I thought I was fooling everyone, and I went back to the campus one weekend and called Meredith to see what was up, and she wouldn't take my call, and then a letter arrived in which she essentially wrote me off, saying, "We don't understand what's going on with you. Your parents are grievously disappointed. Your friends can't understand why you're wasting your life. I don't want to hear from you again. Don't call, don't darken the door." I took that letter to a common friend of ours, a very prominent now Russian studies scholar at Tufts, who was a debater at that time. And I showed it to him, and I said, "Can you believe what Meredith has written to me?" And he said, "She's right. We just don't get what's going on with you." I did a 180 at that point, turned right around and put my life back together, commuted from a job that I had and got very good grades and spent all my time working and studying. And Meredith came to me one day, typically in the library, and said, "I went too far, I was out of line. That was not my place to tell you that you needed to straighten up." And I said, "No, I really had it coming." And we had a cup of coffee, and 9 months later, we got married. Now, I want to tell you, the two most surprised groups in South Dakota were my friends and her friends on the other side. She'd been Miss South Dakota. She was president of the Omicron Delta Kappa, the honorary degree society. Everybody saw this great, great, bright future for her, and she ends up with Brokaw. And her sister said to her, "Tom, why Tom?" She said, "I have a hunch. We may not have a lot of money, but it's going to be really interesting." And it has been very interesting.
So, that's a great story. So, now, on The Greatest Generation, I do want to talk about this, and I would spend most of the time talking about it, but I do want to talk about one other thing first. This is about the trial and tribulations of veterans who've served and fought for the country in World War II. But you've written a book recently about your own trials and tribulations, a book called A Lucky Life Interrupted. And this is an incredible story about how your life is so great, and then all of a sudden an illness struck, and what happened?
Well, in the summer of 1973, I developed lower back pain. Now, I'm a really active, even for my age, athlete. I had bicycled across South America that spring. I'd gone to Africa on safari. I was over covering Mandela's final days. I came home. I was doing a lot of fly fishing in the Missouri River and continuing my biking. I couldn't get rid of this back pain. Over the years, I'd seen orthopedists who, because I was a rock climber and did a lot of the stuff, they would always say, "It's your lifestyle, you're getting a little older, you got to do a little therapy." It wouldn't go away. So I'm on the board of the Mayo Clinic, as David mentioned, and I went there, and I thought I better have one more look at it, and the orthopedist there concluded, "It's your lifestyle." My very smart primary care physician said, "That back pain has been going on too long. Let me run some tests." And took some blood in the morning. I thought nothing would come of it. Called me to his office that afternoon. He had the chief hematologist from Mayo Clinic there. They were reading off the screen these numbers that sounded like an SAT test to me. I didn't know what they were talking about. I thought maybe I'd gotten a parasite in Africa. I was inclined to do that on my exotic travels. And in the end, that doctor turned to me, and this is what he said. He said, "You have a malignancy. It's called multiple myeloma. It's a cancer that is not curable, but it's treatable. But you know people who died from it. Geraldine Ferraro, the first woman to run for vice president, died from it. You must have known Frank Reynolds, the ABC anchorman. This is what he died from." And we all wonder how you would react to that. I went into a kind of twofold mode. I was first a father and a husband. And the first thing I thought was, well, my family's going to be okay. We had just reviewed our financial standing and where we were in life and where we wanted to end up, and I knew the kids were going to have everything that we had said that they could have. And the second part of it was journalistic. I said, how long? And he said, statistically 5 years, but there's a lot of progress being made, and we think that you should be able to beat that. I want to take one more look at the test. I had a number of other questions. Behind him, I could see my primary care physician, with whom I'd gotten very close, Andrew, looking very, very concerned. He really knew my lifestyle and what kind of life that I'd had. And I didn't pick up on that as much as when I thought back on it later. He knew what I was in for. I didn't. No one said to me, this is going to be excruciating. It's bone cancer. You're going to have a lot of pain, and there's going to be a lot of uncertainty along the way. So part of the reason I wrote the book was to share with patients what they need to ask, what more they need to know. I went back to my hotel room. I was working on a documentary on the 50th anniversary of Kennedy. I thought that'll be a distraction. It was up to a point, but I had my iPad Googling multiple myeloma. What the hell is that? And Meredith was in Montana. I didn't want to tell her on the phone, so 48 hours later, after a lot of tests, I went to Montana, and I sat on the edge of the bed at 2 o'clock in the morning and said, our life has really changed. I've got cancer, and I don't know what this means. And that was the beginning of what was an ordeal, but I was always optimistic. And part of the reason that I think I got through it, which gives me a transition to the World War II generation, is that I was raised by that generation. That generation was always stoic. You took what came to you and dealt with it. I used to say about my dad that I always thought he would bleed to death through his hands. They were always completely beaten up because he was a mechanic and a construction foreman operating heavy equipment. He had a terrible back situation, never complained about it. He just came home at night and sat, with a glass of iced tea and stared at the wall. And our life depended on his ability to work, so we knew how unnerving this was for him. He was ultimately repaired at the Mayo Clinic, it turns out. So it was very instructive to me, but during it all, the culture in which I had been raised was helpful. Same was true for Meredith. She was the daughter of a physician in Yankton who was everybody's go-to doc. And she should have been a doctor, but in 1962, when she graduated from college, women were not encouraged to do that. There were 8 other doctors in her family. She became my in-house physician. And our eldest daughter, Jennifer, is a brilliant ER physician in San Francisco whose whole goal in life is to heal people, make them better. So she moved in as my ombudsman. And at the Mayo Clinic and Sloan, both, they said, we'd take her on our team anytime. She kept me in balance. It was harder than I thought it was going to be, a lot harder.
You were hospitalized for many, many weeks.
Well, I wasn't hospitalized as much as I was just, David, at one point I had to be medevaced out of Montana. I couldn't move. I was in a bed. My youngest daughter had become a single mother with this darling little boy, and she brought him over to give me a kiss, and my knees flew up to my chin, and my hands flayed about. I was in that kind of nerve-wracking pain, and no painkillers were helping, so they got a plane, got me to Rochester, and doped me up enough that I recovered, and I came home, and I was housebound. And I couldn't get out of bed in the middle of the night. And the great thing about Meredith, when I'd have to relieve myself, I'd have to wake her up because I would be immobilized on my back. She'd go get one of those hospital containers with a crooked thing, and I would do it, and it was all very slow motion. So finally, we've always had a great sense of humor. I said, I don't know what the doctors call it, but I call this Tai Chi P because of the way we're going through this. It was, everything was very ritualistic. And I needed them to draw the line for me. I needed them to say, no, you're not going to do that, Tom, or, this is something you have to think about. I simply couldn't have done it. So I came to 3 big conclusions. One is, if you have a friend who has cancer and no one in your family has cancer, you can be sympathetic. But until it happens to your family, you cannot be empathetic. And if it happens to your family, to one person, everybody in the family gets cancer. It radiates through their lives. And my young granddaughters were very conscious of not making too much noise when they came in. We call them the hooligans. They live on the west side of New York, and they're very exuberant kids. And at one point, trying to get them to dampen down their exuberance a little bit, I tried to explain them the meaning of decibels as a way to measure sound. And the next week they came up and very solemnly, the two of them walked into the bedroom and said, they call me Tom because they've seen me on television all these years. And they said, Tom, we're going to keep the decibels down this weekend.
So can you tell us your health status now? You're feeling pretty good? You look okay? You look great.
I'm actually, it's been kind of amusing. A lot of people come up to me and say, I stayed at home. I didn't go to the office a lot. I was able to work at home. I did that documentary on Kennedy, and I worked with Angelina Jolie on Unbroken, but I'd have to really measure about where I could go out. And then when I would show up at the office, people would say, God, you look great. And I finally said, if I look great with cancer, how did I look before I had cancer? That's what I want to know. My health, I'm now in remission. They're very encouraged about that it's going to stay there. You know, and the line is, you're going to die someday, but I don't think it's going to be multiple myeloma. I do have more back issues than I would like. I had 4 fractures in my spine as a result of this, and they had to go in and repair those, and I lost 2 inches of height, which was really a blow to my vanity, I must tell you. My daughters, who are tall, young women, not so young anymore, they love to come up and look me eye to eye now and say, well, you're still the big man in the family, but you know, we can kind of see where you are at this point. So that's a big issue. I just have to monitor my back a lot and not resume my crazy get on the airplane, fly to Afghanistan for 3 days, to go to Iraq, you know, get on another airplane. I have a very active fall coming up, but I'm able to kind of measure that. I've got a lot of aids now. I've got a really good back cushion that I use on flights, and I take a couple of painkillers a day, and I'm trying to dial down from that. So bottom line is I'm in good shape, I think, for where I've been.
Great. So let's talk about the end of your broadcast career at NBC as nightly anchor. Very often people have that job say it's one of the greatest jobs. That people usually don't voluntarily just say, I'm going to give it up and go do something else.
Right.
Why did you decide to leave as the NBC anchor?
Well, there were a couple of reasons. One is that when you're the NBC News anchor, you're on a very short leash. You know, there's just a telephone call away from, got to get to the office right now. I remember being in Montana the night that Tim called me and said they've arrested Gorbachev, and I had just gotten there. So the next thing I know, I'm on a charter to Detroit on a plane to Moscow, and I had to look forward to 10 days in Montana. Another time I got to Montana and our daughter called and said, Princess Diana has been in some kind of a crash. Same routine, get on the plane, go to wherever it's going on. I wasn't home, I don't think, 2 days in a row during 1989. You know, the Soviet Union was coming apart, Tiananmen Square, Nelson Mandela was being released. It was very exciting, very fulfilling as a journalist. But then there are other seasons in my life that are important to me. There's a steelhead fishing season in the fall. There's a bird hunting season that's coming up now that I love to do that kind of thing. And most of all, I thought I didn't want to just do the routine of Monday through Friday, here we go again. If I were there right now and leading with Donald Trump every night, I'd call in sick, I got to tell you. I can take the risk of saying that because he's already called me a loser on television, so it's okay.
So I decided to step down, but when you stepped down, you were in your early 60s, more or less?
Well, I was, but what I wanted to do, David, was to continue as a journalist, but in a different form. Okay. I wrote 2 books. I did long-form documentary work. I had really the luxury of going somewhere and not looking at the clock constantly, saying I've got to get on nightly in 2 hours.
So how did the idea for a book about World War II veterans and what they had contributed come to you? Where was the idea from?
Well, I have to give you a quick background. I was born in 1940, so my first memories of life were of World War II. Consciousness developed when we were living on an army base in southwestern South Dakota. And for a tot, it was very exciting. It was an ordnance depot, and so they were manufacturing at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, shipping up to South Dakota, storing it there and testing it. So there were explosions going out on the prairie, everybody around me was going to war, coming home from war. There's a picture in the book of me with a helmet on in front of this little tiny house in which my mother, there were 5 of us, I don't know how we lived there. So that was my first conscious memory of life. And then we moved to the center part of the state where after the war, and the great public works rush in America, they were building this enormous dam. And my dad had a great job, and everybody that I knew came from his kind of background. They were working class people, and they'd come through the Depression, and now they were getting a good wage and buying their first new car and thinking about sending their kids to college, and I was one of those. So the war receded for me until I got to where I became the anchor of Nightly News, and we decided to go do a documentary about the 40th anniversary of D-Day. And I went over thinking, God, great food in Normandy, and I was training for a marathon. I can run through the hills. And then I walked down the beach with 2 men who'd landed in the first wave in the Big Red One who later earned the Medal of Honor, the other one who later lost both legs. And I turned and looked at their wives, and they looked like the women who had been my Sunday school teachers or my mother's bridge partners at home. The men looked like my dad's crew. And I thought, my God, where have these people been and how many more are there? And they told this absolutely riveting tale about what it was like. So I then started collecting these stories and these characters and thinking about people that I'd known. I wonder if they were in the war. And everybody that I turned to, who had been an adult in my life, had been in the war in one capacity or another. So I kept collecting them, and on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, for the first time I used the phrase, the greatest generation, on the Today Show. And Stephen Ambrose was there, and he came to me and said, if you don't use that, I will. So I thought, man, maybe I better see if there's a book in this. And then there have been people who have contested in the past, David McCullough, and I've always had these wonderful, friendly discussions. He said, the great Tom, founding fathers. I say, yeah, they didn't give women the right to vote. They didn't recognize slaves as citizens. These guys were imperfect as well, and the women were as well. But it was my title, and as I later said, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
All right, so how long did it take you to do the research and then write the book?
Well, I was involved in another book at the time, and then I came to the conclusion that this was a much better book to do. Random House didn't have a book really in the works when I went to them, and they said, stop everything, do this book. And my editor, Kay, had a really great idea, Kate Medina. She said, make it about the American family, divide it up into family parts. So I found this terrific, I'd never written a book, so I was terrified about whether I was up to it. I'd written a lot of magazine articles, I'd written a lot of op-ed page pieces and other things, but a book is a whole different enterprise. And there was a woman that a lot of people recommended who worked for Hillary by the name of Liz Boyer. She was scheduled to go to law school that fall, but she said, God, I love this project. So she came to work with me, and she was absolutely irreplaceable. And then a man by the name of Frank Gannon, who was a Nixon speechwriter and helped him write that book when he went to Elba, was a great, great figure in the world of journalism literature. My editor, Kate, had lost her husband that summer, so she was not as available. I didn't know whether I had a book or not. I sent it off to Frank, didn't hear from him for 2 weeks, and then it came back bound, proofread, corrected, footnotes, and said, I think you'll want to make some of these corrections, and by the way, it's going to be a big bestseller. I had no idea. And the book came out, and it was a runaway hit, and it was exhilarating.
Well, tell us about, in the book, you have some very famous people who were movie actors or famous in other areas, athletes, and they talk about their World War II experiences. Then you have average people nobody had heard of before. Talk about some of the famous people that surprised you in terms of their World War II heroics, or that they had been in World War II. You must have...
Yeah, well, some of them like Bob Dole were well known, obviously, and Joe Foss, who was the governor of South Dakota. What was not well known, was I knew in a way, and I included him in talking about this. George McGovern never played his war record when he was running for office. He had the Distinguished Flying Cross. He was a heroic bomber pilot. Almost no one knew that. And I thought, it's time that they know that. And then as I had no idea that Julia Child had been a member of the CIA, or in those days, the OSS out in Asia. Mark Hatfield, was an anti-war, a very religious man, and there he was in his naval uniform, because when Pearl Harbor happened, he went down and enlisted, and he ran landing boats on Iwo Jima. So there were, every time I'd turn over something, there would be another person like that.
And the people you interviewed say, well, they thought the leaders of the war hadn't run it properly, or that they had regretted enlisting in the war, or anybody ever regret anything they did?
None of that. Ben Bradley is a perfect example. You know, everybody in this room knows who Ben Bradley is, I assume, and it was one of the most important things he did in his life. There's a wonderful picture of him in there, 1942, graduates from Harvard early. He's in his naval ensign unit outfit, and he goes to war. He goes on a destroyer out in the Pacific. He's in the Battle of Midway. And he said it was the single most important experience of his life. All the things that he did, Watergate, living in Paris, starting Newsweek, all that, the war, to the very end, our conversations, he said, that was a defining experience of my life. And later, after the book came out, it was a big hit, and we were writing sequels to it. Someone that you know was, I was in New York one night, and in a big gala fundraiser, and I saw this very elegant statesman from Wall Street by the name of John Whitehead walking in, and I thought, I wonder if Whitehead was in the war. So I went to him and I said, John, were you in the war? And he said, yeah. And I said, you want to talk about it? And he said, no. He said, I said, well, why don't you write me a letter and tell me what you did? And he said, well, I have a pretty interesting story, so maybe I'll do that. So he wrote me the story. And the story in shortened form is that he went to Haverford College, and he was a lot of his friends were conscientious objectors, so he testified on their behalf, and then he went to Harvard as a Navy officer and learned quartermaster skills. And he was the lowest ranking officer on his ship. And they were in northern England. He didn't know what was going on. He was spending all of his time in this new little boat that they'd been assigned, trading potatoes for toilet paper with other ships and keeping his ship supplied. And the commander called him up to the bridge one day and said, Whitehead, you've gotten to be pretty good at that. John had never met the commander before, and he said, yeah. He said, I'm, you know, as a sailor, and I kind of know what I'm doing. And he said, we've got a big operation coming up in a few days. The guy who was going to run that boat, his mother died, so he's had to go home. You'll be in the boat. John had no idea what he was in for. Well, it was D-Day, and on D-Day, he talked vividly about losing a man as they were trying to go down to land in the ships. The guy was so loaded with equipment, he fell into the water, so they brought the davits up so they could have the PT boats higher, and then they got in. And he'd been given orders. He was 22 years old. This is the sector that you land on. Don't absolutely move either side of that by 2 meters. And on the way in, he was leading this parade of PT boats, 6 of them, 22. You can see through the binoculars where he was supposed to land was rocky, and there was a bad tide at that time. And he thought, if we do that, it's going to be a disaster. So he often said to me, my first big decision in life at 22 was to disobey my orders. And I really thought that I'd be stripped of my command. But I radioed everybody else, go hard, port, we're going down 200 yards and landing there. And did, and all their guys got off without getting wounded. And he said he went back to the boat, to the ship, and he was being served breakfast with white linen on the table, and silver, by African Americans who were the stewards, who knew so much more about seamanship than he did, and it was a big lesson to him in the division in this country. Then he went back at the end of the day and stood on the beach and realized it was going to be successful. And he said it was the single most important defining moment of my young life. He went on to this enormously successful career on Wall Street.
Because of this book, you've become very closely identified with veterans and people who've served the country. And how has that experience evolved, and what do you do now with veterans and people who've served?
In a way, I can't do enough. And I write in the book about my illness. It really did come to me at one point. I don't think I ever really felt sorry for myself. I got very impatient. But one day I was trying to keep my life in context. And I remembered very well coming out of Iraq. I caught a hop on a medevac plane, and it was filled in the belly of the plane with guys on gurneys and stretchers, seriously wounded. There was a young woman down there who was their nurse in charge, and she asked if I'd have my picture taken with some of them. Some of them were already missing limbs, and I said I would, and I began to talk to her, and I said, are you married? And she said, yeah, I am. I said, you have children? She said, yeah. And I said, are they at home with your husband? And she said, no, he's up in the cockpit. We're a reservist, and we're both here, been here for 9 months. And our grandparents are taking care of the kids. But that's what we signed up for, so that's why we're here. And I always remember that because if I can, for just a moment, tell you something that I feel very, very strongly about. We have less than 1% of our population in uniform. We're asking them to take all the risks, to come home missing limbs, to be psychologically damaged, to come home in body bags. And they re-enlist, and they can't wait to go back. If they're wounded, they always say at Walter Reed when I'm there, Sir, I want to get back with my outfit. It seems to me that's immoral for a democratic society, to have 1% of its population in uniform. And we're not going to have the draft again. The military doesn't want it. They like motivated people who are going into uniform. But these people in uniform need help. And they're over there fighting the bad guys all night long, going into the villages by day and saying, we're here to help. We can build for you a power plant. We can get a commissary going of some kind to get some Western food. We can build a small hospital for you. The villagers, when they see these people in uniform, and I've been beside them, they're very, very wary and skeptical. The merchants almost always say to me, these poor little merchants, we don't need more people with guns telling us what to do. So one of the things I'm hoping to accomplish in the next few years is that I've been pushing hard for a new form of public service, and they're formed at public service academies at land-grant schools, and we have a pilot project going at Arizona State that will be not just go off and feel good about what you're doing for 2 years, but will tie it to the private sector as well, so they can learn real job skills and have a connection to the private sector and corporations, and give the millennials an opportunity to serve their country in which they don't have to put on a military uniform. That's what's always served us well. So I would hope it would happen.
Have you thought about writing a book about the generation that has served in Iraq and Afghanistan, or talking more about the 1% issue, or how would you encapsulate that in a book or an article or speeches?
Well, one of the things I've been thinking about, David, I'm not giving up anything here, but I'm at an stage in my life when I think about the influences that I've been exposed to. And I've come down to consolidating it into big ideas. And the first big idea in my lifetime was how we mobilized for World War II. We were the 16th military power in the world in 1938. And then suddenly we stopped doing anything peace-related and civilian-related and became a great war machine. And that's why Churchill knew that when we got in, they were going to be able to do it. We were the factory. We could provide troops and materiel and everything that we needed. So that was a big idea. Next big idea, in my judgment, after the atomic bomb, was that Congress, even though we were in desperate economic straits toward the end of the war, voted for the GI Bill of Rights. And all these men and women came back. And a lot of them were junior high and high school dropouts. And suddenly they were going to college to learn to be engineers and physicians and teachers, and the people who made it possible for our generation to have the life that we have. That was another big idea. George Marshall Plan, big idea. We were rebuilding Europe so we would have them as our allies, and we needed that kind of an anchor in that part of the world. John Kennedy, we're going to go to the moon. Unleashed technological engineering expertise and excitement about doing that kind of hard science and escaping the bonds of Earth. Richard Nixon had a lot of bad big ideas, but he had a big idea, and that was that we'd triangulate Russia and develop relations with China, which had only 800 million people at that time. But he understood that great civilization, 2,000 years old, that we'd have to deal with them at some point, that Mao wouldn't last forever. Ronald Reagan came determined to take down the Soviet Union by military means, if necessary. Was persuaded that you could do it peacefully, and did. Not a shot was fired. The 60s, big idea. I went through all the 60s. There are a lot of big ideas in the 60s. The biggest idea of all was Dr. Martin Luther King and the rights of African Americans to be full citizens. What were the two principles that he believed in? Nonviolence and rule of law. Think about that. Those were the two pillars of the civil rights movement. And we are a much changed country. We're still dealing with race. We still have a long way to go. But without him, that big idea. 60s also gave us a greater appreciation of tolerance, and most importantly, it gave us an opportunity to allow women to take their rightful place in our society. I honestly believe, I honestly believe at the end of this century that historians will look back and say that was the century of women. Every day I come across more women who are doing jobs that were only reserved for mostly white males before, and they're doing it brilliantly. Warren Buffett's got this great line. He said, if we've done this well with half the brain power, think of how well we're going to do with twice the brain power, frankly. I say that as the father of this remarkable woman and 3 brilliant daughters and 4 granddaughters as well. I know, I see them and where they're going. And then the big idea after that was Silicon Valley. Be disruptive. Find ways to do things that are new and unconventional. There's never been a technological revolution like Silicon Valley, and we're just at the beginning of it. Changes everything that we're doing. Communication, research, commerce, anything you can possibly imagine, making the world much smaller. So, big ideas. I would like to write something about that, and I would fold into it about the big ideas. You're not going to have conventional warfare anymore. I think what we're seeing is ISIS is going to be conventional.
So you have done many different things in your career. What would you say you're most proud of having achieved?
I think what I'm most proud of is that I got it mostly right. That when I didn't get it right as the anchor or as a journalist, I would quickly go on the air and say, we were wrong on something. And I worked very, very hard at playing it straight with the audience. If there is a oxymoron in American life, it is modest anchorman. We don't exist, frankly.
By the way, when you were at the White House, you were covering the Watergate period of time, is that right? So did you have any idea at the time that Nixon would have to resign, or did you ever suspect that he was involved as much as it later turned out?
Yeah, because what happened is that there was never a moment when he won one. He lost almost every turn of the wheel, and it was more and more clear. And then I knew people had been around him a long time, and they knew about who he was. We were talking about it today earlier, and I'll just quickly say about the White House press. We understood as the White House press the consequences of this story, and so people played it very carefully and very straight. There would be the odd duck that would come in and kind of throw the grenade in the press conference. But by and large, the White House press dealt with the facts as we knew them. And part of the standard was set by Ben and by Carl and by Bob, the way they wrote it in the Washington Post. And we played by those rules. So, but at every turn, it would always be against him.
We have time for a few questions. People want to stand up here and ask your question to Tom Brokaw.
The World War II generation included all the other people on the other side, Japan, Germany, and so forth. How do they fit into the greatest generation idea?
The people on the
other side.
On the other side.
The soldiers and civilians in Japan, Germany that we were fighting.
There was the people who were our opponents. How would you fit them into the greatest generation?
Well, that's interesting because I think there was, there are 2 things in my career that I will probably never get the answer to. One is what made up Richard Nixon, what made him who he is. I mean, I am eternally fascinated by him. And then the other thing is how those 2 nations that we now know for all of their technological achievement and their great pride, Germany, the center of civilization in Europe, could engage in the darkness that we were all witness to, and the Japanese. The Japanese, in terms of how they treated American prisoners, were beyond cruel. And if you go down through the ranks of the Japanese and talk to the people, they believed in the emperor. Germany, it was a military class that, that they didn't like Hitler, they didn't have a high regard for him, but they were Teutonic military people, and they were going to proceed that way. So I don't think it was the same. I think, especially in Germany, the post-World War II generation, and how they rebuilt their country and all they've achieved in the same way in Japan is really quite remarkable.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for writing Boom. The question I have as a boomer is of course, one of the big ideas of our generation was the war on poverty. And I would like to see you, if you are going to write a book about big ideas, address that again, because as you know, the war on poverty didn't exactly work out the first time around, and we got sidetracked.
Yeah. I have mixed feelings about the war on poverty, the way it was executed. I was in Watts. I was an idealistic young reporter. I never saw so much waste and so much wheel spinning that went on with it, so much bureaucracy. Part of the reason that I like my public service idea is that you include corporate sector and train people. When I rolled this out to a group of financial and foundation people in New York, a woman said to me from the GE Foundation, what do I do about the 17-year-old school dropout in the Bronx, been out of school for 2 years, not going back? And before I could answer, a representative from Alcoa said, train him as a welder and I'll hire him. So there are jobs, but it's not just we're going to set something up in a kind of artificial way. We're going to get real jobs that people can learn, and we have to develop this country from the ground up. It's really hard. I have no illusions about it. It's hard politically, it's hard realistically, and it's hard in terms of finding those jobs that people are capable of doing that will pay well.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Mr. Brokaw. I want to start off by giving you a huge thank you for everything you have written about the world's greatest generation. My mom would be so proud and would be so thrilled to be here. She watched you every single night. She was a field hospital nurse in World War II. My father was a civil engineer in World War II. They met stateside. They only had a month engagement. He had pancreatitis or something like that, and that's how they met. And when she got her orders to go off to Europe, they got married. So on behalf of me and many people, I really appreciate it. I grew up hearing stories about my mom getting out of, before she could get out, there were the mobile hospitals. She had to put her boots on because it was the mud, and how they would wash their undergarments in their helmets. So all this thing, and I didn't really appreciate, I mean I did, but I didn't. And now I feel like I am so fortunate because I realized
Your question is?
My question is, I'm sorry. I just really am such a big fan. But here's the thing is are you, because I would love to know if you're doing any kind of sequel to that, because there's many, many stories out there. I mean, I'm the product of World War II vets along with my 6 sisters and 2 brothers. And there's so many more stories to be told. Yeah,
that is not uncharacteristic of that generation. And then you expand it to the larger political and economic culture. In Washington, for example, during Watergate, I'd go to the Hill, slip out of the White House, and I'd go talk to Bob Griffin, who was the number 2 guy on the Republican side, and Bobby Byrd on the Democratic side, and others that I knew up there. And invariably, I would come back feeling okay, because they had strong feelings about what was going on. But at the end of the day, they would talk among themselves about what was in the best interest of the country and how we were going to advance that. And that happened across this country. I grew up in a Main Street small town in South Dakota, Yankton, and there were Republicans and businessmen and Democrats and so on. But at the end of the week, they were all at the Elks Club dancing and hanging out with each other and carrying. My dad was known as this genius for fixing cars. So my father-in-law, the physician, would say, Red, I'll trade you my garden space if you'll fix my car. And that's how they would work things out in those communities. There was no hierarchy kind of thing. So I do think we need to get back to having common bonds. One of the things that worries me most about this campaign and how it's being conducted right now, it's all determined to divide everybody.
We have run out of time. I want to thank you for okay. You are obviously a great American, and we are very much in your debt, and we look forward to reading many more of your books and many more times seeing you on television.
Well, I want to say on behalf of David, who is a mover and a shaker in this community and beyond. You know, the Magna Carta, I was with him at Monticello recently, been on the board of the council with him. We owe him a great debt. This man has been extraordinarily successful, but he has done so much for us.
All right, well, thank you, Tom. Great.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.